Hello everyone, I'm Clint O'Brien, Associate Director of Programming at CEDA. Welcome to the second event in CEDA's series Pandemic to Endemic, Proofing Against Future Pandemics. The impacts of disease and health crises have long changed societal norms, government priorities, and shaped our built environments and how we interact with them. As the economic impacts of lockdowns begin to ease and Australia seeks to rejoin the global community, we convene today to discuss how the pandemic and lessons from it are being used to inform how and where we might live, work, and play more safely, and where our focus should be if we're to meet the challenges upon us now and in the future. Let me acknowledge today that we meet here and convene today and every day on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, as at all CEDA events, you'll be able to interact with our speakers through the online Q&A portal, which is available in the link below the video frame on your screen. Or you can enter the details by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the passcode post-pandemic. Post your own questions and vote on questions from others and complete a short survey to let us know what you thought of today's live stream. You can, of course, join the conversation with us on Twitter by using today's hashtag post-pandemic or by following CEDA at CEDA_news. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our live stream sponsors, GSK, who CEDA has worked with this series since inception, and a very long time supporter and CEDA member supporter of all of our work, Siemens. Thank you both for the support, and thank you to all of our speakers today for joining us and to the audience joining us from right across the country. Finally, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to today's moderator, Dr. Mel Miller, partner at Deloitte Access Economics, who has a long history in and understanding of health and health policy, and who will be our moderator today and of your questions. Mel will shortly provide us with some opening comments, introduce our speakers properly, and kick us off and get us underway. Over to you, Mel.
Thanks very much, Clint, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on your time zone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And thanks to CEDA for the opportunity to discuss these important issues and hear from leaders in the field of technology, design and HR about the way forward as we move into the endemic phase. I've been asked to take a couple of minutes just to ground the discussion, and I was thinking that one way to do that, a discussion about moving forward, might be to have a quick look at the past. In fact, there's been a lot written, a lot of scholarly work in the last couple of years about the history of pandemics and how it relates to the present. And the key messages that I take from those reflections is that significant advances nearly always follow pandemics at the cultural or the societal and industrial levels. Going way back to the 14th century, for example, the Black Plague or the Black Death as it was known, the death rate was so high and it led to such significant labour shortages that workers were empowered to demand and receive improved terms and conditions. And some historians even suggest that it was the key determinant of the total collapse of the oppressive system of serfdom across Europe in the Middle Ages. So there were improvements then at that time as well to the engineering of public sanitation and the introduction of the practice of quarantine. Remember, we're talking about the 14th century. Rolling forward to 1918 and the global flu pandemic, governments were forced to rapidly move to develop centralised health service systems, albeit different models across different countries, that we now all benefit from to ensure timely access to good curative care. There were changes in housing codes and legislation to reduce overcrowding. There was the redesign, albeit very low tech, of equipment to reduce contagion. For example, the phasing out of wooden hospital beds, replacing them with metal beds, easier to clean and keep clean. That time also saw the beginning of the realisation that societies need to focus on prevention. The broad social determinants of health and well-being are not just curative medicine. And I must say, I don't think we've quite nailed that balance yet. Many of these things have echo today, but, different content perhaps, but definitely similar processes and the scale of change that we're facing now. So on that note, I'd like to warmly welcome those who've joined us online while I've been speaking and introduce our speakers. Malcolm Smith, Australasian Cities Leader for Arup, David Fitz-Gerald, Head of HR, Australia and New Zealand GSK, and Jeff Connolly, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Siemens. The format today, just to reiterate, is brief introductory comments from their perspectives, and then followed that by some facilitated discussion amongst the panel members and between the panel and the audience. Please don't forget to add your questions to the Pigeonhole app. So over to you, Malcolm.
Mel, thank you very much. What an interesting way to introduce it, as I'm an architect and Australasian cities leader responsible for designing cities. We're currently working through the design of the new capital for Indonesia. But, you know, an interesting phrase where often resonates in our work: a city is more than the place and space. It is a journey in time. And that journey that you've just mapped for us is very interesting in relation to the pandemic. But where do I want to start here? I guess I want to start by, you know, the appreciation of what the pandemic was doing in terms of a level of disruption. I've recently returned to Australia, growing up in Queensland, but I'm based in Melbourne now, living through the early days of the pandemic in London, palpably feeling that kind of sense of what was it about, how did we manage it, the kind of the agile process. I had a little bit of an insight, as my partner is an infectious disease consultant based in a North London hospital. We felt it. But look, I really want to just kind of focus on two thoughts today. The first one is the notion of the pandemic as a kind of vehicle of disruption. I'm increasingly hearing people describe it as kind of this kind of great experiment, the natural experiments that kind of come through humanity occasionally. And what are we learning? So the notion of disruption, I guess, we increasingly kind of try to look at it in Arup in two ways. Disruption can be broad and long, as we are feeling in the pandemic. That is a rare form of disruption. Often the models of disruption we feel are fairly short and narrow. And so how do we increasingly kind of understand and take the lessons out of this long and wide disruption that the pandemic puts through our cities and the worlds in which we live? I guess there's two ways we begin to think about it. One is that we have the city of the everyday, you know, where we do the things on a repetitive notion and the way in which we do it. But we have the city of disruption. And increasingly, I think, as cities, because of the aggregation of population, have a kind of increased vulnerability to more people when there are disruptions of a negative type, we need to understand what are these disruptions in particular places. So the process of kind of, you know, looking at the notion of a short, you know, disruption or a pandemic scale disruption, I guess we increasingly, as that relates to city making, we're beginning kind of to deploy what are the priorities, what are the kind of emphases of disruptions of particular places. Could it be the kind of seasonal monsoon disruptions of Mumbai, the challenges of water supply in Cape Town, of bushfire disruption in Sydney? But what are these conditions? So there are some that are collective, like the pandemic, and there are some that are local. But how do we begin to prioritize those, understand, and then prioritize those? Once we've got those, what do we do with them? Now, this is where I think there is a serendipitous moment, and it'll be interesting to see whether Jeff kind of explores this, of the moment of the pandemic and the moment of our digital capacity to not only monitor impact, but to equally begin to model scenarios of change. So we are placing increasing emphasis on the ability to kind of, as we reimagine new pieces of cities or new cities, how do we model conditions of those disruptive elements? And we're starting to get to a point, I think, Mel, we would have been in a very different place if we hadn't had our digital capacity, and maybe time will look back at it as the pandemic met our digital world. So there are kind of the physical outcomes of that interesting research that we did on the relationship of access to open space as we were restricted down. how once we had basic needs satisfied, that became a priority in people. And it really has a kind of interesting morphology in cities of the way in which they've grown, of where people have access to open space and where they don't. They relate to transport, they relate to poverty, they relate to land use and industry. And so how do we kind of reappraise that? But look, I wanted to kind of finish my second thought with, it's not just about the physical structures. Cities are this magnificent representation, sometimes challenging, of our social and our economic aspirations and drivers. And so I wanted to kind of finish on, if there is a disruption that we've felt out of the pandemic and we see some of the physicality of those disruptions, what are the social conditions that we're actually also should be aware of and heightened? And, you know, one of the great things of working from home, you can flick that TV on in the middle of the day, and I happened to do it yesterday, you know, and the National Press Club speech by Sam Mostyn, you know, an incredible discussion on the underutilized resource of 52% of our population, of our female population in Australia. And how do we kind of understand the reuse, the rebuilding, the reintegration of those assets as we come out of the disruptive elements? You know, now we've been thinking about not only an issue of gender, you know, the role of children in place, the implications of age, all of these conditions and levers as we model new scenarios of the way in which we kind of come out of the change. So look, looking over the horizon, you know, there is the great experiment that we've just lived through, I think, and are living through in the pandemic. But there is no doubt in our mind that maybe that was the introduction, or the kind of the early warning opportunity of the next great experiment that we believe is coming, and that is our response to climate change. Pandemic has shown us the ability to respond quickly, at scale, strategically, to a degree globally, collectively, but also some of the negatives, you know, of selfishness and kind of, you know, border controlling and all of those type of things. So look, I hope that the tragedy of the pandemic, you know, the enormous senses of loss and that we've felt, is also an opportunity to almost reskill us socially, culturally, mentally, and tactically in relation to modelling scenarios of the future. And I think as we embark on thinking of the form of the city as we go forward, I think we understand that it's opened our eyes. And maybe as we move from the pandemic area to the endemic condition, those daily or regular reminders will be the catalyst to allow us to think about how we build back in a different way. I'm going to hand over to David.
Great, thank you, Malcolm. Let me begin by again acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands in which we gather and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us on the call today. And it's my privilege to join the panel and be with you all virtually today for this second session of the Pandemic to Endemic series, focused on examining the bioresilience or adaptation and change after the COVID-19 reset, or perhaps the great experiment, as I think we've all thought through, and how we future-proof Australia for future pandemics. It's an area of discussion that I'm particularly passionate about as it relates to workplaces, but more specifically to the people and to the cultures that inhabit them. And GSK is a proud sponsor of this discussion and this series. So as the head of HR for GSK, for Australia and New Zealand, a key element of my role is ensuring that our culture and our work practices allow my colleagues to thrive, to do their best work for our patients, and ensure that we are future ready. So during the first event of the series, there was strong agreement from Professor Peter Doherty and Professor Rania McIntyre that a multidisciplinary approach was key to successfully managing pandemics. They also highlighted that a pandemic signalled changes to the way we live, and of course this includes the way that we work. And for all of us, the pandemic has changed our life. It's created challenges, some of them absolutely tragic, but it has also come and presented opportunities as we've needed to adapt, to experiment, and to evolve. and utilising new technologies and systems to support things like remote working, supporting our people in all of their diversity to perform their daily responsibilities and care for those around them and themselves, all the while ensuring that we remain focused on our company goals. So across the country, GSK employs about 900 Australians in many areas of expertise, from manufacturing, clinical research, marketing, sales, supply chain, who in some sense are the heroes of the last 18 months, making sure that we have all of our products to our patients on time and in full. And we have a wide range of experience in our workforce, from those starting out as interns during the pandemic in their first roles, through to our executive leadership team, who've been challenged like never before in the last 18 months. GSK is known as an innovator in medicines and vaccines, but the pandemic has prompted us to take a significant step forward as an innovator in the workplace. It's pushed us to find new ways to support our people to thrive and fostered a philosophy of flexipathy, which I'll come back to in a moment. Our experience has shown that maximum flexibility, together with clear and consistent communication, has had a positive impact on employees' resilience and preparedness for the unexpected. This meant that we needed to acknowledge that at all times, or at some times I should say, our people were facing more pressing issues than work commitments, and that people's experience through the pandemic have been quite different. So how does that relate to future-proofing Australia against pandemics? It's well known during the pandemic that our workforces around the globe and Australia have experienced, and I should definitely say continue to experience, high levels of burnout and mental exhaustion. Many people have reevaluated their relationship with work, where they work, how they work, even prompting predictions of the great resignation that's due to come at some point in the coming year. Making sure our people and our organisations are well equipped to handle sudden changes in the working environment could mean that we see less of an impact on employment and beyond. One of the ways we can build resilience to pandemics or other disruptions in the workplace, and as Malcolm mentioned, I think thinking about climate change and the disruption that the bushfires that occurred not so long before the pandemic began is another key disruption that we need to be mindful of in the future. It's to create frameworks that support peak performance for all employees, and that the constraints that have historically existed to govern flexible working are removed, which ironically have at times restricted flexibility rather than enabled it. And at GSK, we used the experience of lockdowns to evolve our approach to flexible working, what we call performance with choice. At the heart of this evolution was that we don't have a policy for flexibility at all. We have a framework that is brought to life by our culture. When it comes to where you work, this framework asks employees to consider the work they need to do and the place that will enable them to perform at their best, whilst considering their role, their team, and their personal circumstances. Now, what this doesn't mean is that you can work remotely and never come into the office again, nor have we mandated a set day or number of days that you must be in the office and be face-to-face. And we've also been really clear that flexibility isn't the same for all roles, especially for field-based roles. Engaging with customers face-to-face is still a core requirement. We've encouraged people or our employees to have open conversations, to identify ways of working that support their performance and their team to feel safe and secure, knowing that flexibility is available to them. In a sense, the great experiment has proven that the flexibility that some had enjoyed will work for a much broader group. And that's been a key lesson that we're taking forward as we approach the next phase of living in a post-COVID lockdown world. Companies that can create these flexible systems of work will not only be better placed to manage future pandemics and lockdowns and other external disruptions, but they'll also be in the driver's seat when it comes to attracting and retaining talent in a competitive labour market. And I think it's best summed up by flexipathy, a combination of flexibility and empathy. Empathy has been so important because no one individual goes through the crisis in the same way, and that is where flexibility comes in. So approaching pandemic preparedness through collaboration and adaptability is crucial. especially when it comes to developing smart technologies and building environments for us to work, live and play in, which makes today's speakers and topic of discussion oh so relevant. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jeff Connolly, CEO of Siemens Australia New Zealand, to make some opening remarks about pandemic resilience and what factors we should keep in mind as we embark on a journey to future-proofing the environment we live and work in. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, David, and also thank you, Malcolm. I think there's been a lot of ground covered in this session and the previous one on pandemic to endemic. And the use of the word endemic means we just have to learn to manage it better. It's a risk management issue, not a risk avoidance or elimination issue. I'll try to pick up on a couple of themes that both Malcolm and David touched on, but I'll start first by thanking, of course, CEDA for this series and more broadly for the platform that CEDA provides, the unique platform that CEDA provides to discuss Australia's most pressing issues. It strikes me this issue is not, in a way, unlike the energy transition. There was a lot of talk about the what for a long time, and actually now we get onto the how. And this discussion is triggering. So what do we do about it? Given it is what it is. So what are the ways that we make that roadmap? And the International Energy Agency on their Net Zero 2050 have 401 milestones to work through, and we as a nation need to, I think, on the energy, do something similar, but also in this particular topic, I think we need to get the priorities set and actually start working through in a more systematic way. You can hear that I come from an engineering organisation when I say things like that. And again, before getting into the content, we can't never say it enough. We can never acknowledge enough the traditional custodians of the lands that we respectively and virtually are connecting from, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and in my case, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Let me start by referring back to a piece of work that I think was quite seminal, but it didn't actually get a lot of airplay, and that was the Group of 8 did a collaborative paper called The Roadmap to Recovery, and it was trying to work out, how do we manage this coming out of the first waves of COVID. And I'm reminded that work started by pressing the point that we need to frame everything within an ethical framework. Start there, work out what your priorities are according to the ethical framework, and then get into the discussion of balancing long and short-term impacts and trying to make sure that you're proportionate to the actual risk in a reduced time frame. So of those ethical framework issues that were raised that are relevant to this discussion, of course, civil liberty, balancing the competing needs of the healthcare system. We don't need to we should never overburden. And of course, the workers that are working in that environment need to be safe. And more broadly, the protection of the more vulnerable people in our society. So again, whilst governments of Australia managed the outbreak of the virus in the early stages simply to reduce the spread, I think we didn't have much choice. And at this point, it would be really remiss of any Australian not to say, we did a good job, but now we've got something else to do. There's no politics attached to that. Whatever happened, happened. Now look forward, don't look in the rear vision mirror, because only getting an organised roadmap into the future will take us somewhere. None of us want to reinvent new terms. I was just musing when I put some notes together for this discussion. I never knew the term social distancing until 2 years ago, 18 months ago. And the idea of elbow bumping somebody as a warm, affectionate way of greeting is sort of a bit interesting. But again, those things came very fast in the crisis, and we've moved on. We've had, in the Victorian case anyway, 263 days of lockdown, 380 days of indoor mask wearing, 329 days of cinemas, theatres, music venues all closed, and 306 days where our restaurants could only serve takeaway. And anyway, in Victoria, not to mention curfews, restrictions of movement and exercise limits. So, okay, we've been into purgatory. Now the question is how we actually manage this whole thing in a better way. I mentioned my praise for governments throughout Australia, and I would acknowledge at that point there was a need to be blunt because we didn't actually understand what we're dealing with any certainty. So there were measures there that were put in place basically because we couldn't actually address the issue of containment of the virus in the environment we're in. With those learnings, we might say that many of the measures were really only necessary because our built environment was never engineered to effectively assist to contain the spread of a virus like this. It's a bit like an engineering discussion on renewable energies. I recall the one in South Australia when the transmission lines blew over in a storm, and suddenly there was no power in South Australia. Well, they were engineered to a once in 50 years event, and they were built about 80 years ago. So again, it depends how you engineer something as to whether that's able to respond. And now comes the challenge to re-engineer something based on new knowledge of what actually the solution needs to address. And that, namely, of course, is early detection, better containment. And I've done some CEDA discussions of late, and we talked about infrastructure 4.0 and the stages of the development of infrastructure. And I'll get into what I mean by infrastructure in just a second. But this prevent, detect, respond, what are we going to need as a society as our minimum standards in the future in new build? Are we willing to say, if you're building a new building that's going to house large parts of the population, these are the minimum requirements, and those standards will be different to what they were in the past? And are we willing to actually add into public policy measures that facilitate or incentivize an informed technology refit of the existing environment? You know, there's a lot of business case there unless there's some sort of push in public policy to move us forward. So digitalisation is at the heart of the solution in many of my speeches. If it's energy, if it's manufacturing, and in the area of infrastructure, for example, there's no question. You know, we were at bricks and steel. We've moved to semi-automated buildings. We've got now fully intelligent building and infrastructure. Requires real-time response. Can all your elements of your infrastructure respond to something in a much faster cycle time? And for those of us that watched the batch edition of the updates on the pandemic restrictions, that's what we were living. There was a response, and it was a wait and see for a period of time, and then we might get the next easing of restrictions or something stronger. So the question is how to reduce those cycle times. And from our perspective, of course, you need to implement a lot of technologies and a lot more sensing of mission-inspired sensing of what's going on in the environments. If you ask me specifically, what are some of the things, and they exist. They're not technologies that largely don't exist. We just have to develop them and implement them. Filtration, UV lights in air handling units, and the MCG already has it to reduce down the amount of virus that can possibly be within those systems and spread amongst that amount of people. Ionization technologies, electrical charges, and Bones particles, they're already installed in the National Gallery. They're there. That particular project, the Project Natural Gallery, was part of the Greener Government Buildings program that the state government had assisted with, and it was on the background of energy efficiency. But with more of that sort of thing, those technologies can be fed into those places where we meet en masse. Other technologies managing airflow, I think that's already been mentioned a couple of times, but you can adjust the humidity easily. You can do it at times of the day that you need to actually sink the viruses down. Simple things like push buttons on doors. Why? You know, I don't know. I guess I'm not different to the rest of Australians who you walk into any public bathroom at an airport and you're looking for a place on the door that you might push that nobody else has pushed before you. So you don't pick up the contaminant. And just very simple things. But doors should automatically open when you approach them. You don't need to touch them. So yes, technology, but we just need to roll those out on a roadmap basis. Vaccines, without question. Australia's own sovereign capability to produce its own vaccines. We had that in the early stages of the pandemic discussion. That's happening, needs to get a little bit of a hurry on. And if you combine that with the host of measures that we need in the what we call the bio-resilient infrastructure, it's purpose-built to address the challenges and the learnings that we've had from the early stages of the pandemic. So on that note, I'll hand back to Mel to continue.
Okay, thank you so much to all of you. Jeff, there's a question for you that leads nicely from your last statement from the audience. And I, again, just remind people in the audience, if you want to ask a question, to do that via the Pigeonhole app. But Jeff, the question for you is, the concept of bio-resilient infrastructure makes sense, but where do we start?
Yeah, I tried to allude to it in the sense of standards. And I tried to allude to it in the sense of retrofit in public policy. But if you ask me which areas to start, go back to the ethical framework, the vulnerable. First off, I think you need to get that addressed to get the society coming along with you. Mixed communities with high densities. I think if you talk about nursing homes, healthcare centres, hospitals, no brainers. You have to get that capacity up. If you look about shopping centres, grocery stores, those sorts of things that are critical to the infrastructure, keeping running and giving us the maximum potential freedoms. Schools, universities, without question, and they're relatively efficient in terms of rollout. Commercial buildings, offices, to get us back to the office environment, the social impact of not seeing people, I think we probably all underestimated. When we all thought, oh, this is great, people can work from home for 3 days a week. I think that's now balancing back. And maybe if I add a fifth one there, Mel, manufacturing. We really need to be able to continue manufacture, because at the moment, what we're seeing is supply chain blockages that will have other impacts if we don't get that right. So probably they're the five, I'd say, well, low-hanging fruit.
Excellent. So there's another question for Malcolm. Do you foresee any significant shift in where people will choose to live, and any likelihood of that being supported by governments long-term to reduce growth and overpopulation of urban centres?
Yeah. That's the big question on the shape of a city, isn't it? Look, Mel, I'm often reminded by, I try to kind of draw the analogy of history, as you did when you introduced it, of the way in which people have had, when they have choices, where do they choose to live? You look at the United States, pre the railways, it was concentrated on around New York and on the East Coast and all of that. You open up by trains and connectivity, and people choose to be able to communicate and live in the Sunshine States, whether it was south in Texas or over in California. There is a choice of lifestyles. I think, it relates to what Jeff was saying, the way in which we work and the work that we do, in knowledge environments, you are certainly liberalized to a degree because of our technological, digital connectivity. But I think what I'm still watching with interest is the pendulum swing. What I didn't say in my introductory thing was a kind of an innate belief in that kind of human condition of coming together. I think David talked about some of those kind of senses of our humanity. And while at the top of the priority list in the pandemic was a kind of a little bit of survival, with fear and all of that, I think as that abates and we re-ask ourselves, what does it mean to live with each other and in what relationship, I think that context of where then follows. And I think what the pandemic has actually taught us is, or guided us, or asked the question, is maybe not taught us to many of us, is what are the priorities of life? Is it with who or where? I think the where discussion is a short-term response, and I think we'll see it play out. What we will see, I think, increasingly is the ability to be slightly more local. This diagram of a center of a city and a kind of a concentric diagram of in and out, I think, is changing. We will see localization of hubs and environments, and that will change the requirement for provision of services of many of the things that Jeff alluded to. So I think the pendulum's still moving a bit, but this kind of human spirit of coming together, I think, will endure.
And so that probably leads nicely into a question for David about, you talked about the flexibility and the empathy, and the questioner says, with flexible work shifting the concentration of workers away from central city hubs, also relating to what Malcolm was just saying, we're seeing city centres struggle to revive. What are the key priorities? Oh, sorry, this is more for Malcolm, sorry. Priorities for urban and city planning.
I think there's a deep piece of what David was talking about, because I think it is people driven. So I'll say quick words and then might throw to David, Mel. If that's, look, next week we've been lucky enough to work with Committee for Sydney on the future of the CBD, and are gathering a series of commissioners and reflecting on thoughts of the role of First Nations, the role of manufacturing, some of the things that Jeff talked about. I think what we need is an agility of the way in which we use our kind of built form increasingly. We designed incredibly, tight singular use conditions. Experiences over in the Netherlands where planning requires you to demonstrate multi-use scenarios as we're designing products. You can't kind of have this kind of narrow condition. I think the other thing that I find interesting is the notion of the central business area, which is a condition of often common accessibility in the city. It's a relatively common distance to travel to. What does that redeploy itself as? I think what we're finding is a connection between knowledge industries and manufacturing that we used to polarize. We used to put making out somewhere else and we'd have knowledge somewhere else, because that was the kind of thing. We're starting to see the kind of synergy and interrelationship of those and these ecosystems of knowledge, funding, translation, and making. Our offices in London, when I was there, we had a titanium knee joint manufacturing unit sitting on the first floor of a building across from the pub we used to go to, across from the design offices of Arup. Manufacturing and kind of knowledge and creation, I think. So use changes will become much more porous. But David, you may have some thoughts as well.
And David, before you get going, there are related questions, so I'll get them in there. So there's two at least. But what do you think will happen for companies that choose to snap back to the old ways of doing things? And opposite side of the same coin, perhaps, do you see lots of organisations taking a similar strategy to their workforces? And then a related thing is about the management of the significant culture change and change management.
Well, okay, there's a few parts there. So I think I just wanted to comment on Malcolm's comment before about the pendulum, and I really think that's an important point. Where we settle with regards to the impact of the pandemic with regards to how we work, I think 2022 will probably be we'll be continuing to learn through 2022, because particularly in Melbourne, and obviously not everybody that's joining the call is in Melbourne, but in Melbourne we've had such a sustained period of lockdowns that we haven't really had an opportunity to see what's it going to be like to work in an environment where you've got a greater number of employees connecting remotely, but you've still got a good mass of people that are in an office. And I think we refer to that as sort of like the hybrid working phase, where you might have a meeting like this where we've got the panelists all together connecting in the same way, versus a future not far away where we might expect two or three of us to be perhaps in a boardroom together and two or three of us connecting remotely. And I think that we've still got a ways to learn to see where we settle. I think what the impact of places like the CBD and those central locations, I think what you want from an office is changing. So I think in the past, an office space was about doing work and to an extent also being seen to do work. So your manager could say, do a quick head count, yep, everybody's here, they're on time, we've got all of the equipment here that you need, and you do your work in the office. But I think more now the offices are becoming places to connect together, to collaborate together. And that's a fundamental shift for some office spaces to actually be well equipped, to bring people together, to be able to be modular and adaptable to smaller groups and larger groups, and I think also to connect effectively. I wonder how many people on the call when they're doing hybrid meetings have just got one laptop plugged into a bit of a dinky-die kind of speaker, and you've got people that are 3 or 4 meters away from the speaker who can't be heard by people on the call. So I think now that means that our bigger office spaces might need to evolve, and it might evolve, I think, beyond work use. Maybe there's other ways that spaces could be used. They might be used more flexibly for people to come in for a fixed period of time and then go. So Mel, then in terms of just those other points in the question, I think it was around. Can you just remind me? It was around
and I suppose this might be a question for everybody, but the level of the management of the culture change and various terms, but change management.
Yeah, look, I think that as I mentioned in my opening remarks, what we've really focused on is having culture as the enabler of flexibility. So we've actually got rid of a policy document because we just felt that was a policy document by its very nature says what you can do, what you can't do, and all the steps you must go through. And so culture becomes really key. Now, culture is brought to life through good conversations with managers and employees. And that it's a big change that our managers are going through at the moment about how do I lead, inspire, and support my team if they can't all be face-to-face with me. And some people have adapted to that really easily, but for others, it's a really big change. So we've done a lot of work in supporting our managers, giving them tools, having regular touch points to make sure that they know when they should ask, how they should ask. We're available in the background to coach, but really it's coming from the good conversations that our managers are having. And fundamentally, it comes down to trust. Trust is one of the pillars in our organisation, and this is a way that we demonstrate trust in the workplace. Because if you can't see someone, I think some managers feel a little bit uncomfortable. How do I know if they're really there? It comes down to the trust in the organisation.
Yeah, excellent. This is taking it up from the organisation to a broader level, and the question is, globally, the pandemic has eroded social cohesion and perhaps trust, particularly when it comes to political discussion and public health responses. How can we repair and future-proof social cohesion for the next crisis? So I open that up to anybody on the panel who wants to speak to it.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to start if you like. It's interesting how even in these forums, the more thorny questions maybe start off with the HR head to kick us off. But I think you're absolutely right. It has been very divisive, but I think also at the same time, there's a way in which the pandemic has brought us closer to understanding each other through this little window that we've got right now, and how we've met people's families and pets, and we've just gotten a bigger window into ourselves as individuals. And I think that has also, perhaps that's a counter to some of the divisiveness that exists, I think, in the external environment. And I think also these forums have enabled us to have more regular touch points together as organisations, in town halls where everybody's on, contributing questions in Pigeonhole or in the chat on Teams or Zoom or whatever it is. There is an opportunity to be more transparent and share more. And so I think that whilst there is divisiveness, there are also opportunities to create better understanding, build trust, and share more, which I think can really help the organisation and everybody feel united in what you're trying to work through.
Yeah, one of the other things that occurs to me as a result of that asking of that question is and it's receiving a fair amount of attention, is how do we deal with the extraordinary levels of misinformation and the purposeful use of, some parts of social media or all parts of it by people who are seeking to shape the public discourse in a way that isn't evidence-based. Any reflections on that, Jeff? Have you got your hand up?
Mel, thanks. And it's interesting that David triggered me to the response about transparency. I referred to the Group of 8 paper that was written, Roadmap to Recovery, and they talked about the ethical framework, they talked about key imperatives, but they actually talked about the prerequisites. And at that time, the prerequisites, they were saying, well, we've either got to do a controlled adaptability model of managing in and out in ever shorter cycles what's happening, or elimination. And I think we've probably got to the conclusion now there's too many variants likely to run down that path very strongly. But they concluded in that piece of research that whatever you choose as your model, you've got to have early detection, you've got to have quality isolation, you've got to have trust and transparency, and you've got to get society engagement. And there, I think there's some lessons about how we bring people along and that they feel like what they're getting centrally is actually what's going on and they're not getting half the story.
Yeah, and I think one of the very early points that was made, and perhaps going back to the first in this series, of that the solutions are going to have to be multidisciplinary, and bringing in the best of behavioural science, health economics, and so on, or behavioural economics rather, to make sure that we have the majority stream of the information being stuff that's productive. So there's a few more questions to get through. Do any of you have any views on the environmental aspects of the pandemic and the waste produced? Are there any lessons in the last 18 months for the future or applying circular economy principles?
Well, maybe I'll kind of jump in on that one a little bit because I guess I alluded to it. Jeff nicely kind of set out, we were being set challenges that we hadn't seen before, and we needed to initiate a response, see an action, and then adjust the path of travel accordingly. In the process of doing that, I guess we were deploying resources, and that produced outcomes of waste. But I guess it kind of also relates to your previous questions about operating collectively, and in a city is a kind of collective entity. Simultaneously, it's our own spaces. And so what are those common territories? And I guess I alluded to it by, when there is a common purpose, the history of looking at the way societies has worked. You look at the Apollo program, the Americans announce they're going to the moon and back, and by the time it's happened, it's a global, it's a collective buy-in, responses to World War II, et cetera, where collective entities, collective spirit begins to do. I can't help but think that maybe this is the first question and we'll go into the waste one, but, it's interesting to see the formation of the new German government of, trying to kind of form these coalitions that get them to a governing majority. The only condition that they found they could have a common entity was climate change. And I think that, when I heard that this morning, I kind of triggered, is this the beginning of the kind of a new common purpose? We are feeling it, whether it's bushfires, you only have to see some of the models of sea level rise and implications to the Australian population and the wider region. And those kind of pursuits of common purpose, it's a very different challenge. But I do think the other thing I would add to this on a kind of more palpable kind of experiential condition, I think, is the role of culture and arts and sport. I don't think we should underestimate that as a device to deploy that kind of re-energizing of the sense of collective spirit. So the issue of waste, I just think we have to re-understand, create a new way of understanding the circularity of our resources. And it's not just a result of the consumption in the pandemic. It's the way we see consumption generally, but others might have a thought.
Mm-hmm. There are three final questions so far, and one is Jeff or any of the other speakers seeing a good global example of a country that's making a detailed plan to implement change and apply what's been learnt through the pandemic, as he suggests Australia needs to, and can or should the government do more to help businesses integrate bio-resilience measures to both future-proof and recover?
Yeah. I don't think there's any country in the world that isn't far ahead of where we are. Actually, they might have individual parts which we could benchmark against and add together. I wasn't criticising that we don't have such a plan, but it's the obvious need to put together. And we'll pick up all of those elements. Switzerland is particularly good on their built environment, and they actually, both in circular economy, but in digital twin of everything, including infrastructure. And I think inside that, going back to the previous question, there is a lot of unlocking of waste. If you can anticipate through the design process what it is in whole of life as opposed to just for the sake of the build. And as the colleagues on the call know, that the majority of spend in any building, overwhelming, let's say 80%, is post-construction. So if we can get things built, in my view, for whole of life, then automatically we'll see the ESG imperatives coming through.
One final question is, as businesses, how did you navigate states and federal COVID measures? Did the difference, in brackets, sometime politically motivated measures, affect you? Would you say one set of governance is better than 7?
Yes. Look, we run a national business. We had daily crisis management team meetings in when we could in the boardroom, otherwise virtually, to try to work out how we give instructions to the organisation, because we found ourselves each individual employee listened to the 6 o'clock news and picked up what he thought were the operating instructions, which hadn't yet been gazetted, and anyway they're different every state. And it was a very much an interpretation issue. So it was very, very difficult to have multiple approaches. Having said that, I think in the future we will have regional responses. We need them. We need the flexibility. So that's just something we're going to have to deal with. We've learned a bit, but how we get messages out to sections of our workforce as opposed to one size fits all.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Mel, it was interesting for us in Arup because I guess we have a global footprint. We were watching what was happening with our officers and colleagues in China, and then we could kind of track change around the world. And so I guess we using similar techniques to what, Jeff alluded to. But what David actually said resonated with me a lot. We quickly learned that while we were trying to understand the immediate challenge, the role of empathy was an absolutely critical thing, just to listen and to give it the platform to share. The other thing that I think became very important for us was to almost kind of double down on the culture of who we believe we are, of making the right built environments for people, having response, to double down that there was a kind of certainty and value in the work that we were doing. And that seemed those two worlds were critical levers that we felt deploy as we were watching it, work its way in different contexts.
Yeah, David?
Yeah, I think making sure that, I think having a true north in terms of how we were going to make decisions was ultimately what served us really well, both in terms of the group that was making the decisions, the crisis management team that were making the decisions, but being able to communicate to our employees that we were, employee safety was number one, and that we were following government guidance was that number two. Was also meant that as we changed, as we went up through the escalation levels and as we went down, we were, the decisions and changes that we were making were quite consistent with those true norths. I should say it was interesting that actually escalating was far less challenging than de-escalating through the crisis. and each phase of the crisis. And again, apologies for taking a very Melbourne-centric view, but each lockdown or each phase had its own slightly different personality. So you weren't necessarily able to apply everything that you'd learnt or put in place for the previous lockdown, because there were new elements that we'd had to take into consideration. But certainly I think, God forbid we should ever get through a crisis, we should ever confront a crisis like this again. We should really try and be a bit more consistent across the country on some of the key elements. But perhaps that's reflective of where we are from a political standpoint in the country.
Yeah. Look, we are bang on time. So thanks everyone for your questions, and thanks Jeff, Malcolm and David for your great presentations and very thoughtful reflections. I might leave you with one final thought from a guy called Bruce Aylward, who was the person who led the WHO mission into the World Health Organization mission into China to try and come to where did this virus come from. When he came back to Geneva, he concluded that the major thing that needs to happen as a result of COVID-19 pandemic and to ensure preparedness for the future is a fundamental change in our mindset. And I think you've all reflected on that. A change from individualistic or nationalistic to work together as a human species, to be organised to care for one another, to realise and accept that the health of the most vulnerable people in any population is the determining factor for the health of us all. Failure to do so, he says, dooms us to never being prepared for future pandemics and crises. Thank you all very much for your participation, and over to you, Clint, for thanks and close.
Thanks very much, Mel, and thank you to all of our speakers for giving us your time and applying your expertise today, to what ended up being a pretty broad-ranging discussion. We had everything in there from technology and planning to the end, right through to federation and government question, public trust. So it was pretty broad-ranging. So thank you for participating in all of that in very good spirit. I, for one, certainly enjoyed the pretty strong focus on community that you all had reiterated as well. So thank you for your participation. Mel, thank you for doing a great job as moderator and playing with us today also. I would, of course, like to thank GSK and Siemens again for their support. Your support does help CEDA continue its work and convene important public policy conversations. So thank you very much. We will return with the third part of this series in early 2022 with a little bit of a national report card when we take a look at what we have learned from a country, from a medical perspective as well, and consider what the long-term consequences are for our universal healthcare system and its sustainability. We will send you some details on that shortly. More importantly, though, immediately you can stay up to date with all of CEDA's upcoming discussions via ceda.com.au and register for our next live streams, the first of which is tomorrow on the 26th, Mental Health Reform, Implementing Reform and Improving Patient Outcomes. And then on Monday, the 29th of November, Women Who Lead, Climate Warriors, which is a content area some of you have touched on today as well. Please do take a minute before you log off to provide us with your feedback on the Pigeonhole app. And finally, I would like to thank you, all of our viewers, for your time today and for participating in this conversation. Thank you all very much. Have a good afternoon. Take care and go well.